very much for attending the 10th Global Water Institute seminar series for 2019. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Behavioural people of the Eora Nation and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today we've got the great pleasure of introducing Michael Spencer. Michael, I'll go through his bio in a minute because it's very impressive, but more importantly, Michael is a member of our International Advisory Committee for UNSW's Global Water Institute, so I'm very grateful for Michael's counsel over the 2 years that I've been doing this job. But let me tell you a little bit more about Michael. He has had a rather distinguished career in both the private sector and in the public sector. He's had senior roles with BHP, National Australia Bank and BlueScope Steel, mostly around the governance area. He was a former senior advisor to the Premier of Victoria and was also head of communications at the Water Stewardship Council. He was the founding CEO of the Alliance for Water Stewardship in the Asia Pacific and founding chair of the Alliance for Water Stewardship's International Board. He lectures at RMIT in Faculty of Business Law, and he is also has an appointment as Research Fellow in Business Taxation at Monash University. He's currently writing 2 books. The first one is on sustainable use of water by industry, and that's with the International Water Association. And the other one is the role of non-state actors and environmental governance in China. So would you join me in welcoming Michael, who's going to talk to us today for that engaging topic of drowning with an elephant in the pool.
Thanks very much, and I'll. Lisa wanted me to put this one, so I'll do my best.
Your words.
Try not to look like an elephant myself. I don't think I'll be moving around too much. Thank you, and thank you for creating the opportunity, Lisa, Greg, and the Global Water Institute. It's actually been a great privilege for me to be able to work with the Global Water Institute. I'd also like to join you in acknowledging the traditional owners of this land and their elders past, present and emerging. So there's the elephant in the pool, and the elephant's coming to help you, as all elephants do, and so you're feeling very safe and secure. But I think probably what I was trying to convey in that sort of in that way was a bit of a pun on elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room in terms of dealing with our global water crises is that we're really not addressing the underlying culture that we've brought to water, not just over generations, but really over millennia. And addressing this culture is going to require a heck of a lot of work over a long period of time if we want to get serious about really expanding the water toolbox that we've used for many, many years. I mean, the innovation in the toolbox was the use of regulation from about the 1970s that added to the more traditional ways of managing water. Now, as we move into an era of growing crises around the world, are we going to be able to deal with those using the existing toolbox? I think the evidence is that we're not. And that we need to start to look at other tools and other approaches. And I'll talk a bit about that today. But we haven't made any progress, any substantial progress, I won't say any progress, in adopting and incorporating those other approaches into our water toolbox. We're stuck in the ways that we've always dealt with water. Even though there have been lots of nuances and lots of new technologies and lots of little things that we've added on, the fundamental approach is still environmental and more recently regulatory. So really I'm going to say, well, what is stopping that, and how do we start to address that, and importantly, what are the opportunities? So I probably don't need to speak to this audience about this, but really, this was the high-level panel on water, really just pointing out the severity of the global water crisis, that gaps to supply, sanitation, growing problems, more water-intensive patterns of growth, increasing rainfall, variability and pollution are combining in places to make water one of the greatest risks to economic progress, poverty eradication and sustainable development. And you only need to look at this picture from some work, China water risk, up here on the plateau, which, if I can work out how to use this, might be helpful. The Hindu Kush plateau, which, as you can see, most of Asia's rivers commence and then run through all these population areas. As Deborah and Feng point out, China, India, Pakistan simply do not have sufficient water to ensure food, energy security, plus develop under the current export economic growth model, which creates all sorts of problems for Australia as well. We're not immune from that. It goes to the whole issue of regional security. But unlike a lot of the world's problems, the water problem is very close to home here in Australia and even here in New South Wales, with just some little clips. This was just a couple of weeks ago, published by News Limited. People in this room probably know this more than I do, but the extent of drought and the crisis it's causing in New South Wales, I don't think I need to talk to you about it. This report, Charting Our Water Future, published by the 2030 Water Resources Group back in 2009, argued that meeting the competing demands for water is possible at a reasonable cost, but business as usual is not going to mobilise sufficient capital to address the problem. But efficiency improvement is only going to meet a fraction of the gap. Supply measures face steep marginal costs, and global trends are going to continue to impact catchment. So population growth, industrialisation, climate change, etc., will continue to make the problems more severe. And of course, traditionally, and I heard this, my former colleague Sarah Henderson made a maiden speech to the Senate recently, and she was going to waterproof Australia by building dams everywhere. Not an unusual tactic, and one that we hear a lot, that we can waterproof things, but you know, and of course that's the United States. Over 100 years of dam building, they've got dams everywhere, but they're not short of water problems either. So engineering solutions face cost, both for the public and private sector, competing ecosystem services, so we put dams in there, we lose a whole bunch of other attributes, competing budget priorities. Jevons paradox. Did anyone see the Utopia episode recently where they explained Jevons paradox? It was a great, I want to try and get the clip, because the minister does everyone know Utopia? It's one of those awful comedies that's too close to reality. The minister was going to bust congestion by investing all this money in road building, and wanted to model how it was going to relieve congestion. And so the modeller did this fantastic electronic map that showed all the red areas going green for the first 3 years, and then they all went red again. And the minister said, "Whoa, what's going on? What's going on here? We put in all this money to solve the congestion." And the modeller had to explain, yes, you solved the congestion, and by doing so you attracted all this extra traffic into the centre of the city, so it just grew again. And in many ways that's the same problem we see with water. We build dams, we build infrastructure, we encourage industry to locate there, and then we say, oh, we've got all this industry in the wrong place. China, again, is a classic example. You see different costs of how much China is spending on water to solve its water problems, either 2 or 4% of GDP. The south to north water transfer project, when that was first announced, I remember The Economist had quite an interesting article saying, well, all this is going to do is encourage industry to stay in the wrong place where there isn't any water. So we face all these sorts of problems when we continue to address water without changing the underlying behaviour and the patterns of use that are the problem. And of course, more recently, since 1972 and the Stockholm Conference on Humans and the Environment, we've seen a growth in environmental regulation, which is going to solve all these issues. A 38-fold increase in environmental laws since 1942, 72 rather, but a failure to fully implement and enforce those laws is one of the greatest challenges. Weak enforcement is a global trend that is exacerbating environmental threats despite prolific growth in environmental laws and agency. And of course, being in New South Wales, we don't need to talk about the problems with environmental laws and some of the episodes we've seen here. Simply having laws doesn't change anything. It's having the will to enforce those laws and police them. And that's where often a lot of this environmental regulation gets undermined. Nevertheless, on the positive side, the 2030 Water Resources Group argued that in many cases, large individual end users are going to have to play a bigger role. And then it goes on, millions of end users will need to change their behaviour. Change behaviour for millions of farmers, industrial and domestic water users can start to address these issues. And more importantly, it's got to be linked to government policy. So government policy can help to align industrial behaviour with water goals. None of this is new. You can go back to the 1972 conference. You can go to Brundtland's World Commission on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit, the Dublin Statement on Water and Sustainable Development. They're all stressing the need for behaviour change to be part of the toolkit, going right up to the report that was led by our Prime Minister as a group of, I think, 11 heads of state. Technical solutions alone cannot solve the world's water challenges. It will require government, societies and the private sector to change the way they use and manage water. All water use sectors should embrace water stewardship, strengthen their collaboration and participate in integrated water resources management. So from the early 1970s to this report that was 2018, we're saying the same thing, but are we seeing anything change? Well, no, according to this report that was prepared by the Overseas Development Institute and IUCN a couple of years ago. We're seeing little evolution by companies from business as usual. Often their commitment to programs such as water stewardship falls into the philanthropy category rather than being business driven. There is concern about water risks, but companies struggle to create a business case for action. And there are a whole bunch of, this isn't a theoretical talk, but there are whole bunches of theories around institutional behaviour and the bounded rationality of individuals involved in decision making that tie us into how we make decisions and how we consider issues. We talk a lot about rational choice, but our rational choices are influenced by what we know, what we experience, what people around us say. And so this idea that I sort of roughly group as culture within the water industry is going to be really central to what needs to change if we're going to start to adopt some of these behaviour change solutions. And Robert Costanza and his group, when they wrote the Introduction to Ecological Economics, a second edition came out recently. Each discipline has its own language, its own culture, its own ways of looking at the world, a reductionist paradigm of academia. He identifies as part of the problem in why we can't see these holistic solutions. Earlier, Donna Meadows, who was one of the authors of Limit to Growth, but whose later life was a lot about teaching systems thinking. Too often universities are living monuments to this bounded rigidity. One of the sources that Costanza and co quote that I really love is this paragraph out of Carr, Saunders and Wilson. Every profession lives in a world of its own, the language which is spoken by its inhabitants, the landmarks so familiar to them, the customs and conventions can only be thoroughly learnt by those who reside there. And so I guess what I'm saying is that we get locked into ways of thinking about water and how we're going to solve it, and we've really got to break out of that cage. And part of the reason we get locked in is because we've always done it that way. This fellow Solomon, who wrote this epic struggle for wealth, power and civilization, and the central role water played in that. Wherever water resources have been increased, made most manageable, navigable, potable, societies have generally been robust and long enduring. Those that succeeded in significantly increasing their command and supply regularly were among the few that enjoyed spurts of prosperity, political vigour and momentary preeminence. Water has been fundamental to what we call civilization, and the way we've done it has been to manage the water. Even in some of my work in China, of course, Yu the Great, who's regarded as the founder of modern China and the Yellow River civilization, his claim to fame was taming the great floods of the Yellow River basin. He mastered the water and caused them to flow through great channels. He was the founder of the Qi dynasty, and he was described as a water engineer. So water engineering, the ability to control water, has really been fundamental to the way we think about the world and power systems within the world. Even I saw, I think in another book, Mao's famous swim across the Yangtze, we all thought was a bit of a joke, but it was really, this author was describing it as Mao demonstrating the human ability to manage water and to show that command over water as being central to his rule. And it flows through, of course. This is the founding statement of the Institute of Civil Engineers, a society for promoting the acquisition of that species of knowledge which constitutes the profession of civil engineer, being the art of directing the great sources of power in nature for the use and convenience of man. And you go through to today's Engineers Australia, and it's sort of softened, but it's the same idea that we're going to control nature. And of course, it's reflected in how we run all our water authorities. Almost all of them are run by people with a technical background, generally an engineering background, normally engineering and management, except for QUU, who Water Stewardship now have a project with. But she's a finance person with a big background in water. But all this is, the point I'm making is not to be critical of engineers. They're vital, they're absolutely central, their knowledge is essential. But we continue to reinforce the same track in how we go about thinking about these things and where we look for solutions to our water problems. I went through the Auswater program for 2 years, so 2018 and 2019. And you see here, central to all the titles of all the programs are treatment management, asset management. Yes, there's information, urban, city, and there's a little bit on communities here and there. But a lot of it is about managing an asset and a technical approach to water. Using NVIVA, I went through this, so there's 45 files with 4 to 5 papers in each, so probably about 250 papers for each year, 2018 and 2019. Stewardship got a passing reference in 5 in 2018 and 3 in 2019. Wasn't really elaborated, it was just a passing reference. But behaviour change, which is a much broader term, still only got a reference in 5 in 2018 and 7 in 2019. So very small reference to behaviour change. And I'll come back to the sorts of programs that were covered by behaviour change programs. They were very limited. They weren't very deep behaviour change programs. So the point here is, not to be critical, but simply to say we need to broaden our focus and broaden our thinking about water in order to come up with a broader range of solutions. And I regret to say so I just got this book this year, it's published this year, this is Environment, so it's a bunch of environmental sociologists, and the context is slightly different. They're talking about collaborating with engineers on risk, but this author said, even though the chances of a fruitful cross-fertilisation of the social sciences with engineering sciences exist, in practice there remain difficulties in bridging gaps brought about by different orientations and ontological assumptions regarding humans and society. So I think these are the sorts of gaps we've got to find ways to bridge in order to bring in the social sciences and the behavioural sciences into how we manage water. So the final point, and this is from my research in China, is that it's self-reinforcing. So here when we're talking to, so this research very briefly is about adoption and non-adoption of water stewardship in two programs we're looking at in China. The non-adopters were very distinctive in that they regarded government as responsible for water, and their role was simply to observe the laws and stay out of trouble. Whereas those who were interested in adopting were much more, saw a broader stakeholder responsibility for water, and a whole lot of other differences between the two groups. The ones that were indifferent, who were actually the best performers, were even more strongly in favour of seeing a broader stakeholder responsibility. So the point here is that if it's almost like a paternalistic relationship. If water people say we're going to solve we're going to solve the water problems with our tools, and we're not going to involve the customers fully in how we do that, then the customers are going to say, fine, that's your responsibility, it's got nothing to do with me. So we've got to find ways to deepen that engagement between water and the end users. And it sort of comes back to some of this thinking, you know, the Harden's tragedy of the commons. I put that up there not because I want to sort of go on about the tragedy of the commons, other than to point out that he made the point that it isn't solved by technical solutions. There are issues of morality involved, our obligations to the broader community, our obligations to the future. And to some extent, how we bring that into our thinking is incredibly challenging. It's like with climate change. If we talk about climate change in the context of the here and now, today's generation, we get stuck with, oh, but we might risk one job here or one job there, as opposed to what's the impact on future generations, which is, of course, the point made by Stern in his 2006, The Economics of Climate Change, where he just said he didn't feel he had a moral right to discount the interests of future generations in what was happening today, and so he refused to discount their interests. Ostrom, of course, rejected Harden's tragedy of the commons and said, no, it's not that bad. There are methodologies for managing common pool resources, and water, in many ways, water largely is a common pool resource. It's a common resource that suffers from a lack of either private or full public ownership. So that's one of the things that present particular challenges. And she had this typology that I found useful. There's the Leviathan approach, which is we're going to have a strong government that will make all the decisions. And Hobbes, the philosopher whose book was titled The Leviathan, actually favoured a sort of monarchy just making all the decisions. Harden, who was a follower of some of this, he actually favoured a more consensual directive system. Ostrom came up with rules that were developed often in more simple societies for developing rules for managing common pool resources, whether they're fisheries or irrigation systems or so on. And I'm struck continuously by how in our current management of water in Australia we see this complete confusion between the Leviathan and private property rights. On the one hand, we created private property rights in relation to water, so we separated water rights from property rights. We created a market for water, and then we said, but we don't like the answer, because what does a market for water do? It will direct those resources to the most efficient user, which often doesn't correspond to the templates of communities we have. So we see in the current market system large, wealthy companies buying up water rights at the expense of smaller people in communities. And so this whole destruction of communities through the Murray-Darling Basin, in many ways, can be traced to the trading of water rights. If you're a small farmer and someone says, I'll buy your water rights for more than your farm is worth, and you say, oh, that sounds all right, I can go and retire, and then you sell them, but then the rest of that community suffers, obviously, because those water rights have left, that irrigated land turns back to a brown deserty scrub, and the community, what they call in a lot of those communities, starts to get holes in where the teeth were, as those communities get holes punched in them by people, by water rights effectively leaving the town. And then we have the Leviathan, and we see on TV from time to time during drought, government saying, oh, I'm not God, I can't make it rain. But at the same time, they've set themselves up as the key decision maker on water, and we will govern all decisions on water, and I'll come to a little case study on that in a moment. So we see all this whole scenario being played out every day on our TV screen because of the combination of the sort of never quite resolved on one or the other between a central government or a big government making lots of decisions or the privatisation of water. And we haven't really looked at whether there's scope for a common pool resources approach, which is what I'm briefly going to deal with at the moment. I mentioned Ostrom had her rules for common pool resources, and I'm not going to go over those. You're welcome to go and read her book. But more recently, this woman, Lynn, a Canadian academic, has sort of looked at government-business partnerships, which I found interesting. And many of the issues she talks about are similar to Ostrom's common rules. She talks about the value of government-business partnerships in terms of effective governance, which is flexible and non-contractual, exploration learning, so the development of new knowledge, cognitive learning, different interpretations and rule-making. So she's talking about how do we develop meaningful government-business partnerships that can address environmental issues, and these are the sorts of elements. She actually studied 166 US firms, 192 alliances between 1985 and 2013. And those alliances were to address the similar sorts of problems to what we're talking about with water, where neither the state nor firms make satisfactory investments in mixed public-private goods leading to underinvestment. She found that government-business partnerships can play a significant positive role in channeling public and private investment towards transformative change, and that addressing environmental, it can help in addressing daunting environmental problems that go beyond incremental aims, enable sharing resources, risks, mutual benefits, and can transform environmental practice. So this is the sort of direction that I think we need to start to bring into our water toolbox, as I call it. And in our work in China, we tested the idea of government incentives for good water stewardship, and we found that overall there was a strong support for incentives to become involved, either so for non-adopters it was some sort of tax or levy rebate, for others it might be an incentive payment or reduced compliance or green finance. And we found interest in those sorts of initiatives across the board, but for adopters there was strong interest in incentive payments or reduced compliance. In other words, you don't have to fill out 25 forms, you might only have to fill out 12 forms, because in the areas where we were surveying, they were all suffering a heavy compliance burden already. So if we engage in this water stewardship program, can we reduce our compliance burden? But for others, it was just straight up and down. If there's some sort of reduced tax or levy, then this is interesting to me. The other thing is using this bounded rationality framework. We tried to explore what are the sorts of things, if we've got rational choice in the middle, which is benefits versus costs, that didn't explain behaviour. But when we start to bring in these other issues like the risk environment, so all our case study companies in this case faced some sort of water risk, but that risk alone wasn't enough. It was that risk being reinforced by government and customers that made a difference. Water engagement and performance, again, companies that were more engaged in water were more likely to be interested in something like water stewardship and the internal business culture. So the point here is we've got a long journey. We've got to actually start to change a lot of the internal cultures in our customers towards what we're doing. And I won't go on too much about this, but essentially as we build these programs, we build the reputational benefit from participating. So you start off, depending on where people sit at the start, and this comes from Buchanan's theory of clubs, that as more participants join the program, the reputational benefit grows, so you bring in more participants. And Julia, who just joined us from her time at Ingham's, I remember her constantly saying to me, when are we going to get more companies into water stewardship, because that actually builds the brand, which creates greater reward for the other participating companies. We also looked a bit at this work on diffusion theory, which talks about innovators, early adopters, early maturity, etc. One of the things we find, and Roger's noted this, is that you'll often get innovators involved very early in a program. They're nice but not necessarily helpful, because innovators are often seen as people that are a bit out there, and the ones you've really got to get to are the early adopters who are very influential in their peer group. And so that's one of the things that we realised we had to focus on, not just getting excited because we had one or two companies involved who were early adopters, but how do we get those how do we get out of those early adopters the key influences? And then he talks about knowledge, persuasion, decision, implementation, confirmation as a flow of implementation in the diffusion of new innovations. And all that's leading up to this, which is too muddled to talk about, but it's really saying if we're going to get, if we're going to develop a program like water stewardship, we have preconditions where there's a bunch of issues: scarcity, pollution, ecosystem health, equity, or whatever. But there's also pressure. So regulators, customers, NGOs, investors are putting pressure on the firms. This is a very truncated report on some of this research, by the way, so apologies I'm going too fast. We then found we needed to build a local multi-stakeholder leadership to influence that system. So it involved working with government, working with customers, NGOs, early adopters, and then look at the possibility for green investors. We didn't actually work with those. So they can be helpful. I won't, it's, I'll go straight through to say the application of this was in the Kunshan, just out of Shanghai, where we actually built a partnership with local government officials. In this case, the Environment Protection Board actually went out and sought the involvement of Water Stewardship, of WWF and others, and encouraged the 35 major polluters in the province to work with us. And so we actually formed a collaboration between the Environment Protection Bureau, businesses, WWF and AWS. And we started with the simple idea of providing training, because they were all wanting to know more about how they could improve their business. So we didn't actually go out and say, you must do this whole water stewardship program. They wanted to learn about how to improve their business. So that was the next step. And then we used that to deepen their understanding of what are the issues affecting their long-term water use. And this then led to financial support. So AWS, that I was involved with at the time, developed a partnership with Apple to bring their supply chain into water stewardship, but also the municipal government in Kunshan offered a 100,000 RMB incentive payment for companies to become water stewards. And even though the program's only been going about a year since then, on last report, there were already 9 enterprises that were then involved in water stewardship. And what did that mean? That meant that they were then required to influence their peers. They developed school programs to educate people about water. So industry developed this role and took on the role of building education and awareness about the water issues in this municipality. We're looking at something similar in Australia. So we've developed we've brought the Renmark Irrigation Trust into the scheme. They then became one of the first irrigation trusts to develop a partnership with the CHU, the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, to use their irrigation infrastructure to bring water into wetlands. So through water stewardship, they developed this broader perspective of issues. They then started new collaborations, and last time I heard, the end result was they actually started to build new industry around tourism potential of these wetlands, which had, in the past, had been a bit of a sort of clayed, yucky area. And now AWS is working with the 500 or so individual farmers to bring them into the system. So it's much the same. It's about how we use clusters to develop substantial impacts rather than one-off, which goes back to that cluster-based water stewardship model that I was talking about here. And then this idea of diffusing information through the network to continue reinforcing that model. But when we look at the sorts of behaviour change programs that came through from the Ozwater conferences, a lot of them were of this type, creating water-wise champions, creating Love Your Water, I think it's supposed to be, which is about encouragement for behaviour change. Not necessarily the same sort of depth. Engaging schools and young people. This one had a bit more oomph. It was about permanent, not transient or incident-related community awareness of water use. Or That's My Water, creating generational change in water attitudes, delivering significant rise in the profile of water within local communities and measurable behaviour change, including a 20% reduction in home water use. So we've got a lot of elements. We just need to push on a bit further with some of this work. This is some work that Paul Martin and a colleague did. It was about weed management, not so much water. But one of the things that struck me is that Paul had been doing this work in the Murray-Darling Basin and found that introducing a lot of these behavioural techniques into the weed management program allowed them to better segment the people they were dealing with into the ones that clearly weren't going to engage with them and were going to block, the ones who would engage on certain circumstances, and the ones who were going to be... So it's almost like using behavioural psychology to understand the groups you're working with and what's going to motivate them to engage with the program so you make progress. And I'm struck by the role of behavioural understanding in being able to better target, a bit like we were doing with the Kunshan example, where we segmented into adopters, non-adopters and indifferent. It starts to create a much deeper and richer understanding of how you engage those people. So I think we've got some elements of research that can be built on. Sadly, we've got some elements of research that show us what goes wrong. So this is an older article, 2006. I think it was actually written in 2004, based on attempts to following the introduction of the Water Management Act in New South Wales, which established water management committees in 36 catchments, and they were given responsibility to create water sharing plans, and those plans were largely overridden. And the authors say ultimately water management committees were given the apparent responsibility but not the power to create water sharing plans. Worse still, the plans presented to government were largely overridden. And then there's a whole lot of stuff in the article about how this just demoralised the very idea of participation, and people gave up. And so we went back to the sort of pebbles and bam bam, let's all beat each other up over water, rather than actually trying to press on. And They actually interviewed some of the officials, public officials involved, said decision making has now been pulled more formally back within government and will now be conducted on a more scientific and systematic basis. Power sharing is only likely, the authors conclude this, power sharing is only likely to occur if there's basically a crisis and there's strong political support from ministers. The ministers and the agencies wouldn't let go. So, summary. Change won't happen quickly or easily. It involves deep-seated attitudes to water, but I would argue there's much to gain from expanding the water toolbox. In building shared ownership of problems and solutions, understanding market segments, universities, government and NGOs can collaborate and have an important role. The water industry also needs to recognise and lead that change. Sorry, that was just me playing. But I did want to finish on Banerjee and Duflo. They were awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics recently. And really nice work. They basically found that the economics of dealing with poverty was pretty useless because it just took this bland, poor people are all the same approach. And they delved into how poor people act, how they understand, how they behave, and developed their solutions based on that understanding. And they were rewarded just a few weeks ago. But the foreword to their book leaves you with a bit of a positive thought that above all, our book makes it clear why hope is vital and knowledge critical, why we have to keep trying even when the challenges look overwhelming. Success isn't always as far away as it looks. So, there's some stuff. But thank you. That was a very quick run through a whole lot of stuff. I hope I didn't go too quick and lose you, but I'll be around for a while if anyone wants to chat. So thank you, Greg, and thank you for the Global Water